Sego Joanjo Hetstone Yungyaks, Wagat Dahuni, Tindanega Tikiron. So I told you what my Mohawk name is, and I am part of the Wolf Clan, and I come from Tindanega Mohawk Territory, which is about 60 kilometers west of here. So I've been asked to do opening words for this event, and my teachings have been that when there are 2 or more people gathered, that we offer these words of gratitude. And what I'm going to do it in a very short version of Mohawk, and then I'm going to just briefly tell you in English what I did, okay? So, say, Ohondagari wadekon, de yeti nuarado ne ungwe su'a, de yeti nuarado ne yeti ni stuha ohonja, de yeti nuarado ne oneka su'a, de yeti nuarado ne gunshu su'a, de yeti nuarado ne ohonde su'a, de yeti nuarado ne odehra su'a, de yeti nuarado ne onunkwa su'a, de yeti nuarado ne gakwa su'a, de yeti nuarado ne gahi su'a, de yeti nuarado ne ojinua su'a, de yeti nuarado ne grondo su'a, dano ugari su'a, de yeti nuarado ne gundirio, de yeti nuarado ne ojidun ogun'a, de yeti nuarado ne gayeri nicarage, de yeti nuarado ne ratiweres, donchida wanuarado ne jonkanaka grakwa, de yeti nuarado ne yeti sutta asantanaka grakwa, de yeti nuarado ne oji stokwa su'a, de yeti nuarado ne gayeri niungwedige, donchida wanuarado ne sungwai dison, etoni dunhak ne ungwanagura, danito. So what I did was I offered our greetings and our thanksgiving to everything in creation that was provided for us to live a good life. And I started with the people, and I ended it with Creator. And I spoke to everything in creation, very, very brief. It can last up to a day when they speak to every little piece of it. And so, of course, we don't have that much because we all want to hear the author speak. So, so I want to just say Nyamagoa. Thank you.
Thank you, Betty. Now I'd just like to very briefly introduce our moderator, Eric Friesen. He's a writer and speaker on music and culture and is certainly well known across Canada and into the United States. He's hosted many CBC flagship programs, including All in a Day, Radio Noon, The Eric Friesen Show, and Studio Sparks, among others. Eric has a particular interest in the intersection of music and the other arts, particularly fiction and nonfiction, and he has served on the board of Kingston Writers Fest 2 years as chair of the board, as well as appearing on this festival stage every year since 2009. So we welcome him now to this stage. Eric Friesen.
So good afternoon, friends. I take it you can hear me okay? Great. Okay. What a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon, this beautiful day, with a fellow Manitoban, Wab Kinew. Yeah. Yes. From the heart of the country, and, God's country. Before I introduce Wab, I just want to say, excuse me, what a pleasure it has been to read this book. I'm going to just throw aside all objectivity and say to you, this is a superb book, and you must read it. And I hope you will continue to feel that way when we're done an hour from now. But it is, so big pressure on you. But as I say, what a pleasure to introduce Wab. Many of you will know his voice. He's been involved with the CBC for a long time as a journalist at CBC Winnipeg. 2014, Canada Reads, he championed Joseph Boyden's The Orenda, which won. A lot of Joseph Boyden fans here. And then he did so well that they hired him as a host for 2015 of Canada Reads. And he did well enough that, thank you so much, that he's going to be host again this year.
Yep.
So Canada Reads will have his blessing again. 2012, he hosted a CBC documentary series called Eighth Fire. He has been a correspondent for Al Jazeera America, and he's currently the Associate Vice President for Indigenous Relations at the University of Winnipeg. He's also a musician. He's a hip-hop musician. He's a martial arts fan. He has an economics BA from the University of Manitoba, working on a master's in Indigenous governance. He was an honorary witness for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He's the father of 2 boys, whom you'll get to meet in the book, and his wife, Lisa. He's is a medical doctor in Winnipeg. He's been described in the media as one of 9 Aboriginal movers and shakers that you should know. So after today, you can say you at least know one of the 9. Now, equally important is his Indigenous heritage. He was born into the Onigaming First Nation of Northwestern Ontario, grew up in Winnipeg. He's part of the Ojibwe First Nation, which is part of the Anishinaabe-speaking Indigenous peoples. I hope I got most of that right.
Yes, the pronunciation was good.
Well, thank you. Well, it's one thing
He
you
was
hope
worried.
to still teach you at the CBC. Anyway, and he's also described as a member of the Medewan, which we're going to hear more about. But anyway, welcome, Wab. Great to
Oh,
have
it's
you
great
here.
to be here.
Welcome to Kingston. I think before we really get to talk about the book, I think you should read something from this wonderful book, The Reason You Walk. So have you chosen something you'd like to read?
Yeah, I chose something near the beginning because the story deals with a lot of heartbreak, and there's a lot of challenging moments, all in the name of arriving at what I considered to be an inspirational moment of redemption and realization for my late father. But I wanted to start the book before the heartbreak with giving the reader a sense for the beauty of our traditional culture, and to share a bit of our family lineage as well as our cultural lineage.
Okay.
So the book actually begins with my father's childhood and his family's origins on Lake of the Woods, which is Northwestern Ontario, near the Minnesota border and the Manitoba border. And so this is a scene with his mom, and her name was Nanagijagok, so she's my paternal grandma. When still a young girl, Nanagijagok had been playing one day with her siblings and cousins near Siamozi Bing, not far from where her son, Tabasanakwit, that would be my dad, would be born a generation later. It must have been a warm summer day, probably in the morning, when the sun was beginning to bring heat to the forest shade. The children chased each other, their laughs echoing along the rocky shore, when one of them broke off and ran up a gentle slope into the forest, and the others, Nanagijagok included, followed. Soon they were in pursuit, slaloming through the pine trees, red pine needles on the forest floor, a soft cushion beneath their moccasins. Though they shouted and giggled, their footsteps were softer on the earth than any of us today could imagine. They broke into a clearing in the woods where tall grasses grew, hiding a swamp beneath them. Beautiful flowers danced among the grasses, swayed by the gentle breeze, and the children were drawn closer and closer, away from the trees. In a dreamlike state, entranced by the purple and pink blossoms, they kept moving forward. Just then, a soft cascading sound rose up all around them, 1,000 tiny rattles shaken at once. Nanagijagok and the others stood frozen as scores of dragonflies ascended from the reeds all around them. The beautiful creatures began to arc and tilt, flying circles around the heads of these little Anishinaabe. Slowly, and gently enough to preserve the wonder in the children's minds, the little insects began to sing. It was a calm, soothing melody that traced the contours of the past they flew through the air. The tones rose to a plateau, hung in midair, and then softly landed at a new low. The tiny insect helicopters repeated this pitch before starting their song cycle anew. There was no end, only this beginning. New music. Many years later, Tabasanakwet heard his mother, Nanagijagok, sing this melody to him. She and the other children, now parents, named the lullaby Kopachigun. He would hear it as he sat in a tikanagan, a cradle board, while his mother picked blueberries in the August sun, and he would drift off to sleep. He would hear it at night, rocking in a swing suspended above his parents' bed, and he would hear it sung to him when he was put down for a nap. Me, 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 me. His mother would softly hum. The gift from the dragonflies worked its way into Tabasanakwet's heart, his mind, his spirit. It It was a song that came from home, from mother, from earth.
Bravo. Thank you. So from that lyrical beginning, Wab, just a few years later, when your father's a small boy, what happens? He gets taken to the residential school near Kenora, right?
Yeah.
St. Mary's Indian Residential School. And it was a horrific, I mean, we've heard so many of these stories through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but tell us your father's story.
Well, he did experience the horror stories, and it's in fairly graphic detail in the book. You know, he was physically abused and sexually abused. But I think, his first day was illustrative. He had up until that point only known the Ojibwe language, didn't speak a word of English, and he was named Tabasanaquit by his parents. But when he arrived at the school, they said, well, you're not Tabasanaquit anymore. Your name is Peter Kelly, and you have a number. It's number 54. And when we say that number, you're going to respond to it. And from that point on, he was reprimanded and, had his knuckles strapped or beaten if he ever spoke his language, the only language that he knew. And so from there, I think that just set the tone. And there was a lot of things that happened to him in the residential school that are,
Tell us a story about when his father died at the
yeah,
funeral.
yeah. So he, it's one of the things I used to wonder about when I was a kid. I was like, why did my father's dad get buried at his school? Didn't really understand the residential school history as I was a boy. So my father's father was hit by a car when my dad was still a boy in residential school, and he, died and succumbed to his injuries in hospital, and he was buried in a cemetery at the foot of the residential school. And at the funeral, my father stood next to the grave, as is our custom, rather than kneeling, as the priests and nuns wanted him to. And so following the funeral, they called an assembly in the school, and they beat him in front of the other children to
kneel.
drive the message home. Yeah. And, something happened to my father in that moment. He hardened, his heart, his spirit, his soul. It hardened. And he told me, and it's in the book, verbatim, that, he resolved in that moment that he was not going to cry because he didn't want to give them the satisfaction. And he knew that the physical pain he felt was nothing compared to the grief that he was feeling at losing his dad. And I think that was a very important moment for the rest of his life, because that hardening that went on the one hand, it allowed him to survive what was a very challenging period, and that, perseverance and that sort of will, I think, served him well and allowed him to be successful on a professional level. But yet it also, I think, unleashed and trapped a certain anger and a certain fury in his heart, which led to a lot of dysfunction in later years as well. And so I think the story of this book is in part the story of how he managed to unbreak that, or thaw that
Right.
thing that had been frozen in him so many years ago.
Your relationship with him certainly changed over the years, from when you were a young boy to these last years that we read about in the book before he passed away. What was he like early on for you as a father?
Well, he was harsh disciplinarian and domineering figure that I think a lot of us are familiar with from people from the older generations, the old school, if you will. But he also had a lot of anger too, which I think went beyond just the normal kind of stoic father figure, right? He was a very angry guy. So when I was a kid, I was afraid of him a lot of the time, and we didn't have a great relationship. There was a distance. He's always in my face, and he's try harder, work stronger, do this better. If I would complain, he said, no, that's not what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to say more. I want to do more work. And then, if I was sick, he'd say, no, real men don't throw up. They don't vomit. If I cry, I said, no, real men don't cry, So I know a lot of people probably grew up around, they can relate to moments like that. But, that's what it was like in my house growing up.
Through the years, you became much closer.
Yeah.
Emotionally.
Yeah.
How did that happen, and when did that happen?
Well, I think it started, after I became a man, after I became an adult. I recognized the shortcomings of our relationship, what was missing, the closeness that was lacking between us. And so I resolved to make it better. You know, I used to hear that song "Cats in the Cradle" about like the boy whose father never had time for him, and then, you know, he becomes a man and then he doesn't have time for his dad. And I used to think like, hey, I bet that's what we're going to be like too. And then so I decided, no, I don't want that. So we're gonna spend some time. And then full credit to him, he didn't recoil or back away. He decided to spend the time with me as well to fix that relationship. But I think the process of truth and reconciliation, and I mean that more broadly, not just the TRC, but I mean broadly this whole thing that began in the 90s with, you know, first Phil Fontaine telling his story and then other people to tell their story. And then in the 2000s, it went further with the class action lawsuits. And then eventually 2005, you had the settlement agreement, which settled those class action lawsuits out of court. The apology in 2008, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2010. I think that unleashed something, you know, and it led to that sort of thawing of his heart, as I was speaking about a moment ago. But it also created an opening for us. So we had this situation where on the one hand, the whole country is going through this kind of process of reconciliation on a very kind of macro level. And yet in our family, we're also going on a very micro level through another process of reconciliation, the reconciliation between the generations. And I don't think that you can necessarily understand one without the other. You know, for us, we may not have had that opening to fix our relationship had this broader political, social, cultural, spiritual journey of reconciliation been going on. But at the same time, I don't think you can understand the project of reconciliation in Canada or the damage that was unleashed in residential schools without understanding, you know, the difficulty that my father and I had in getting along. You know? Yeah.
One of the astonishing things about your father is that, excuse me, when he was older, he retained some of his affection for his Catholic faith. I mean, he'd grown up in a Catholic residential school. The nuns and priests were very abusive sexually, as you said, and physically, and yet he retained some affection for the Catholic Church, and he even went so far as to make an archbishop, the Catholic Archbishop of Winnipeg, his brother.
That's right.
As I say, it's astonishing. What in him allowed him to have any affection left for the church?
Well, to me, this is the main question of the book is why do we do right? Is it because we're waiting for a reward in the hereafter, or is it because we're waiting for some sort of extension at the end of our life, or do we merely do right because it is right? You know, do we merely embrace love because it is love? And that was the thing that I saw revealed to me in his journey. So I think on a practical level, it makes sense because he spent years going to Mass and, you know, praying in the Catholic tradition, that did have an indelible imprint on his soul in the way that he wanted to express his spirituality. And so later on in life, I think the biggest steps towards his own personal improvement, you know, overcoming alcoholism, learning to be less angry, learning to be a more compassionate human being, that came from his participation in the indigenous spirituality, the sun dance, the sweat lodge, using the pipe. But yet there was still always something, I think, missing from him. You know, his spirituality was informed by the Catholic tradition, and yet there was this veil, like a veil of racism is how I describe it, which prevented him from freely expressing that side of his spirituality. And what reconciliation and the apology and the audience with the Pope in 2009 did is that I think it allowed for that veil to begin to be lifted so that at the end of his life, he could freely express his spirituality in whatever form that took. And it may be that at some times his spirituality was best expressed in the Sundance. But I think on other days his spirituality was most accurately reflected in attending a prayer service or a Mass in a church. And still at other times it was probably just best expressed in what we would call secular humanism to this day, right? And so I think that is one of the really insightful things that he shared with me is, you know, there's many paths to the same goal, right? And what he was after is not necessarily for this tradition or to reconcile with that faith, but just to be free, just to be honest about where his spirituality was. And so what I witnessed in his adopting the Archbishop after having, you know, kind of had his spirituality liberated like that was that, you know, thing that I think the Golden Rule hints at, which is that, you know, when you are done wrong, you know, you ought to forgive. When you do wrong, you ought to work towards forgiveness. And all that is our attempt to overcome the imperfections in our human nature, so that when we leave this earth, the only thing we leave behind is love. And so to me, that was a very remarkable thing to witness. And it just so happens that, I know many traditions embody this virtue and that type of thinking, but it just so happens that one of the, I think, great examples that we can learn from in these lands comes from the people who experienced the residential school story and who bore the brunt of that experience, because many of them did emerge the other side as these remarkable people.
There's a wonderful photograph in the book of your father and Phil Fontaine with the Pope, Pope Benedict.
The last Pope, the other Pope.
Yeah, the one just before this. He's still sort of emeritus Pope, I guess.
Pope Emeritus.
Sort of. But tell us about, your father made a decision to give the Pope something.
Yeah.
And didn't clear it with anybody, did he?
No, he just did it. So in 2009, Phil Fontaine led this delegation, and they were meeting with the Pope about the residential school issue. And many people have criticized the Pope, including the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for not saying, "I'm sorry." What he did in that meeting is he expressed his sorrow, right? He said, "I'm very sad to hear what happened to you guys." And so many people have been critical and said he didn't deliver a fulsome apology. So I asked my father about this, and I said, "Well, what did you think? Did you think that he, dodged the question, or what was it?" And he said, "Well, on the plane ride over, I was wondering, what am I doing on this trip? Is this all for nothing? What am I going here to see happen?" And so he said in his mind, "Well, I know that, actions speak louder than words. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to offer the Pope an eagle feather." And everyone, I think, globally understands the eagle feather as a symbol of indigenous culture. In the book, I explain a little bit of why. So he said, "I'm going to offer the Pope the eagle feather. And if he refuses the feather, then I know that nothing has changed. And anything that he wants to say it doesn't have very much meaning. But if I offer him the feather and he takes it, then I will know that he has changed and the church has changed, because that couldn't have happened when I was a boy." Right? And so the photo in the book is showing Pope Benedict accepting the eagle feather. So he did accept it when my father offered it, and together they prayed together in the Catholic way, but also in the Anishinaabe way. Right? And so that was sort of like this little microcosm, this little moment that showed that, even though reconciliation's not perfect, there's still a lot of issues outstanding, that things have changed. Even these massive institutions, which, sometimes seem like there's too much inertia to move them forward, they have changed. Right?
Yeah.
And that was an important symbolic moment, I know. So as an aside, I guess it's also kind of a testament to my father's kind of will and,
Chutzpah.
yeah,
right?
that's right. Just put it
To
on
use
him
a-
like that.
to use a Yiddish phrase, to actually do that, right?
Yeah, that's right. So, Pope Francis is in America right now, and everybody loves him. He's the people's pope, but, he just canonized a saint who is very cruel to indigenous people.
Yeah.
On the flip side, Pope Benedict met with our survivors. He accepted the eagle feather, and he canonized Saint Kateri Deguita. So, all that to say, not to say one's better than the other, but, just reconciliation is not a destination. It is a journey, and sometimes we step forward, and sometimes we step back, and sometimes it's a rocky road, and sometimes it's more smooth than it has been in the past. But, we have to work together if we want this thing to work out, and we want to be able to all live our lives free. We have to commit to moving forward together.
A lot of the book, Wab, is about you. You were a wild guy when you were young, right?
A little bit, yeah.
Maybe more than a little bit. At
Yeah.
least.
Yeah, a lot of it. Yeah.
Your father was a chief, and so he's a hereditary chief. It means that you inherit a leadership role as well. And it's very interesting. You were I guess, accepted, or there was a ceremony to make you a chief.
Yep.
At a very difficult moment in your life. Describe what happened there.
Yeah, well, I was basically, I just came out of jail for being in a street fight. And, I had been in trouble a few times before, like, I was charged with drinking and driving and a bunch of other stupid things, mainly me caught up in the party lifestyle and trying to prove my manliness through showing people how many beers I could drink or how many fights I could get into, not understanding how stupid those measures are of manhood. So at that time, when I was near the nadir of my life, you know, my father and my cultural community, the people that I Sundanced with, they made me a chief. And the message they sent to me at that time was, you should be a good person. Not because you're anything special or because you deserve to have a good life, but because you have been gifted with extraordinary opportunity, and we have invested an extraordinary amount of resources and time in cultivating you. And so it's not that you deserve anything, but it's that you owe us. You owe your community. You owe your, nation to be a good person. You should be a positive influence after everything that you've been given. So it's a very remarkable, roll of the dice on their behalf, because I could just, turn my back on their offer and continue to be self-destructive. But what that moment meant for me was the beginning of me leaving that behind and the start of me being a more positive and a more, self-aware human being. Yeah. But again, it speaks to the nature of my father and the community, that it's not just about lectures, that it's actually about doing, and it's about not just your rights, but it's about your responsibility. And I think it's an interesting way of looking at community.
One of the things that, if you read the book, is very obvious is that you spend a lot of time seeking forgiveness in the book, and seeking to ask for forgiveness, especially for your actions as a younger man. It's a searingly honest book. Why did you want to do this so publicly? Because you really bury yourself in this book.
Well, I think there's a few things. Like, one, I'm asking this country for truth and reconciliation. So it'd be hypocritical for me if I wasn't honest about myself and where I've been. So I feel like I have to be truthful. And I have to seek reconciliation in my own life. And plus, I'm not painting a flattering picture of my dad a lot of the times, right? And he was a remarkable man, not only, politically. He was a very influential First Nations politician. On a spiritual level, he's counseled, untold numbers of people, and made a difference in people's lives. But yet, I'm honest about what he was like at home, and that's not a flattering portrait. So, what kind of son would I be if I was like, oh, it's all Dad's fault, and then I acted like I was an angel, or I acted like I have no flaws, and the stakes are different for everyone, but I think it gets at a truth, right? Like, many of us, we're not going to go to residential school, or we're not going to, fight a great war, or we're not going to, face those high stakes. But that same core element of truth is still there in all of our journeys, that as much as we might want to be Gandhi or Mandela, we are going to be held back by the flaws in our character. And, they're probably, for most people, they're going to be manifested at, not quite the level that I manifested them when I was a young man. But still, that same idea of being able to be honest about who you are, recognizing that the truth always makes you stronger so long as you use that truth to push yourself towards growth, I think is an important one. And then using that to try and make amends, and again, try and put things right, so that when you leave the earth, the only thing you leave behind is positivity and love and compassion. I think that's what all that is there to lay out. So why was I honest? Why was I doing this? Well, I felt like I would be hypocritical if I wasn't, and I felt like it's all in the name of serving the broader goal of the book, which I think on the whole is a positive story.
Very, yeah. One of the things that's remarkable about you, Wab, is that on the one hand, you're a man of the world. I mean, you're working in the national culture internationally as a journalist, as a writer, as a musician. On the other hand, you're very much involved in the culture of your people,
Right.
In its rituals, in its language, in the work you do at the University of Winnipeg. How do you manage to be both a man of the world and a man of your people?
Well, I'm just kind of riding the wave. So I'd be lying if I said I had some great insight into how I did that. But for me, I want to pursue opportunity, and I want to feel like I'm a free person in this world. And we live in a global, multicultural, pluralistic society, right, where there is no dominant power in the world anymore. It's very multipolar. And so I want to just be a free person who's out there and, doing those things. And yet when I'm in, the airport in Taiz, Yemen, on the opposite side of the world from where I was born, and I'm lonely and I'm looking around and wondering, what am I doing? Well, where I find a little bit of grounding, or I find like a little lift to my spirit, is I'll read some Ojibwe text. I'll read some book that's published in Ojibwe, and then I feel like I'm talking to my elders or the people I grew up around back in Onigaming and things like that. So for me, it's never been about choosing one or the other, because I don't think Indigenous people can shell ourselves off from the rest of the world, nor do I believe that the rest of the world works best when we ignore where we come from, right? For me, it's all about having both things and being able to carve a space for myself in the mainstream. Because I don't worry about my culture. I know my culture is strong enough to survive in the mainstream. I don't worry that it has to be sheltered and kept over here. I believe that if I am strong as an individual and I pursue success for myself and my family, and I carve out time to be on the land and to practice spirituality and speak the language, then I'll be able to carry those things with me. And for me, one of the things that I want to do in the book, and just on a more broad level, is just to say to people, like, there's something in these ways that is powerful. There is something in this language that is very insightful. And one of the damaging things of colonization is that for the past 150 years, we've been prevented from sharing that power and sharing that insight and sharing that wisdom with the world, whether through legal instruments or social policy like residential schools. We've been kind of hived off and prevented from reaching our full potential. So what I want my generation to do is stand up and say, okay, with increasing opportunity and some strength from our background, here's what we can do. Here's the difference that we can make. Here's the contributions that we can make to rising to the challenges of our time: environment, income inequality, the global war on terror, and so on. So I get excited about that, and I want that to be my generation's contribution to the world. But it's frustrating, right? Because that's the reality of myself and my wife and my sister, and so many people in my generation, educated yet professional and still tied into the culture and language. Yet in this country, I'm still trying to argue why we should provide First Nations kids with equal funding to education, or why kids in this country should have clean drinking water. Right? So there's this disconnect between this lofty vision that I've set and that I want to be able to, share with the world and argue that, and then the very base survival concerns that so many people have. And though the conceptual distance between those two positions is immense, it's literally the distance between the first world and the third world. In geographic terms, it's zero, because I grew up on the house on the res, in the same household with people who are suffering from suicide and prescription drugs, and there was no running water in my community when I was born, and and on and on and on and on, right? So that's one of the really, I guess, fractious or challenging aspects of reconciliation, is how can we get at that, the lofty political goals, or that inspirational spiritual power that can be delivered through the journey of reconciliation, and yet do that without tackling these challenges that remain, right? I don't think we can do one without the other, and it's just kind of maybe a little disconcerting, because it's uncomfortable to talk about the political challenges or the things that we have to do in this country to level the playing field for Indigenous people, right? So tomorrow there's going to be this leaders debate. They're going to debate foreign policy, right? The question I would have to them is, how can Canada stand on the international stage with moral authority to act when there's kids growing up in third world conditions in our own backyard?
Hear, hear.
Right? It's a rhetorical question, so it's not great for a debate. But I would say, ask yourself that question, and any answer to that question you can come up with is going to be unsatisfying, right? Because either it's going to be overly cynical, or it's going to, dodge an important element of the truth. And the part that it kind of, that I don't love about it is that I know I'm being confrontational in posing that question, or I know I'm being edgy, in posing that question. Yet I feel like that is the challenge that remains to be met. in this journey of reconciliation, is how do we marshal the goodwill that I know exists in the heart of the vast majority of Canadians, and yet still be able to sit down and have these more challenging, sometimes uncomfortable talks.
Now, there is no debate that I know of that's going to be taking up this challenge of First Nations peoples. What do we have to do to make it an election issue before October 19th?
Well, I think everyone needs to talk to the politicians, the local candidates, and also the party leaders and the parties as well, party officials. And like what I've noticed about politicians is that they don't lead so much as they follow. Right? They follow what they hear in polls and in focus groups and in opinion collection on the doorstep and things like that. So if people send a message that this matters to me in person or online or in all the various fora that exist, then I think that would send a message. And I think the important thing to say is not just that we want this addressed and we want lip service. No, we're past the aspirational stage. We are in the stage where we need tangible plans. So not just tell me that, hey, shout out to my First Nations brothers. No, not that. Tell us, like, specifically what are you going to do? So, like, the NDP and the Liberals, they've both said they're going to implement all 94 recommendations from the TRC report. Really? Okay. Please. Enlighten me, Mr. Trudeau, Mr. Mulcair. How exactly are you going to do that? What are you going to do first? Are you going to provide equal funding for education on reserve, or are you going to open up the Constitution to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People? Oh, and by the way, didn't you promise not to open up the Constitution in some of your other commitments? Or that's the Liberal challenge to be met. The NDP challenge to be met is how are you going to, they've promised to only add $600 million in new funding. Closing the education gap is going to take about $500 million. So how are you going to meet all the other challenges with $100 million? Never mind all the challenges of the Métis, of the Inuit, and so on and so forth. So I think their fiscal framework is unrealistic. And the problem with the Conservatives, I mean, the relationship, it's not even, you couldn't even start to talk about dollars and cents because the state of the relationship is so acrimonious and antagonistic. And, when Harper says, old stock Canadians, and then he clarifies it, the worse than saying that was his clarification the next day. He said, it's the descendants of immigrants, right? So it's clear to me he's had a day to think about it. Even in that full day, it didn't occur to him once to think about my people as part of his vision of this country or of the heritage of the country. So it's like this whole re-education process of the accurate history of these lands has to be undertaken before they can even talk about the dollars and cents. So, I mean, that would be the challenge there. But even if you are a Conservative supporter, you still do have a role to play, right? Like, you have to send a message to that party that this matters to you, that this is something important that you want them to deal with in a real way. Because I have a lot of friends who are Conservative, and they do great work on the grassroots level to build bridges between communities and, to foster dialogue. But I think there's a disconnect between the people with that commitment at the grassroots level and where the party leadership is at. So I think that, this election with about, I guess a little over 3 weeks left,
Right.
It could be a determinant, right? Like if this becomes an election issue, the parties engage with it in a serious way, this could be a turning point for the country. We have an opportunity with the TRC report. We have an opportunity with a growing Indigenous population, a growing Indigenous middle class to do good things on this. But it could just as easily fall by the wayside and just remain the status quo, which is to say that the issues remain unresolved.
The title of your book, The Reason You Walk, comes from a song you were taught when you were young. Explain
Right.
its meaning.
Well, it's a traveling song. We sing it at the end of all our community gatherings in Northwestern Ontario. And the words in Ojibwe are Ninga Sha Anisha Wenje Pomoseyan. And the way it was taught to me is that it is the Creator is speaking to you through the song. And the Creator is telling you, I am the reason that you walk. And so when my father and this elder, Kwekwe Kibanas, were explaining the teaching to me, they said there's 4 layers of meaning to that song that will reveal themselves to you over the course of your life. You know, in the beginning, it's, I am the reason you walk. I made you, therefore you walk. Then, you know, as you continue down the road, it becomes, I am the reason you walk. I am what animated you. I am, you know, that thing inside you that pushes you forward. Then, as you become a little bit more seasoned, you understand it as, I am the reason you walk. I am that force of love that inhabits the universe and that forces you to do things in a good way or to put things back together when they have begun to fail. And then finally, at the end of your journey, you understand it as the Creator telling you, I am the reason you walk. I am that thing at the end of your life that you are walking back home towards. And so when I was thinking about my father's journey, and really the book is a chance for me to share what I thought was a remarkable journey of reconciliation and forgiveness that he went on, I thought that, yeah, this is what he embodied. He showed us the reason that you walk through life, you know. It's not always easy, it's not always positive, but at the end of the day, the thing that we're aspiring to is that best part of our humanity, that best side of our human nature. And so I thought that the title, The Reason You Walk, would be a fitting tribute to him.
It was very touching the way you spent the last year with him. You and your sister both, you were busy working for the CBC, you took a leave. Your sister was doing a PhD in Rome on Italian Renaissance
Sculpture?
Yeah. A whole other world away. She leaves that to come home. She came home to Winnipeg, and you as a family spent your time with your dad.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah, I understand that not everyone does that, you should, you know. I don't mean to make people feel bad about that, but you should. Like what we saw, and it's very humble things. You're cleaning for him, you know, you're driving him to chemotherapy, you know, you're cooking meals. In the final days, you know, very painful for me is like actually holding him and, you know, walking him to the bathroom and things like that, or catching him when he faints or when he falls and things like that. And it's difficult and it's painful and it's ugly, but what I realized is that it's almost the parallel to raising a child. You know, when you become a parent and you raise this little person and you're charged with their well-being, all of a sudden you understand that there's something more important than your own well-being, you know? And then you have like this better aspect of yourself revealed. You know, you understand love on a deeper level. You begin to see the world in a different way through shepherding this little person through the early years of life. But I think there's a similar journey that happens if you shepherd somebody through their final days as well, that reveals some of the important lessons of life and some of the important lessons of being a human being that comes when you're there with a person in their final days and you help them leave this world with dignity. And so for us, you know, on the practical level, it was, or I guess on the more personal, immediate level, it was that we lived our life in that last year so that we didn't leave any regrets between us. And so when he left, he was my best friend. You know, I was not just mourning my father, I was mourning my best friend. And it was nothing but positivity and an immense gratitude for having allowed us to witness him on this journey. But again, it's in the book. It really hit home about 6 months later when I was in the Middle East and I saw another guy helping his father who just had a stroke through what was probably his final days. So this guy who had falsely been accused of being a terrorist by the U.S. government and later exonerated. So this falsely accused terrorist was there, supposed bad boy, you know, just very gently cutting up an apple and feeding it to his dad who's lying on the floor on these cushions on the floor, and then goes and massages his legs. And as he's massaging his father's legs, he tells me through an Arabic interpreter, he says, you know, if a child stands next to their parent when they are sick, then that person's child will stand next to them when they're an adult. And it kind of like blew me away. And it was like, yeah, that's what it is. And maybe one of the things that we've lost track of in the modern world is that that is the circle of life. And we know, like, we have to be responsible parents and we have to be there at the beginning. But maybe we've lost track of that other side of the circle of life, that we have to be there for people at the end too.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautifully said. It's time for you, friends, to ask questions. We have just about 15 minutes for you to ask questions. We have volunteers with microphones. So who has the first question for Wab? Raise your hand. Right back there.
First, I just want to say what an honor it is to be in the same room with you. I'm really quite humbled. When you were talking about politics and what needs to happen to change the fundamental societal outlook on issues like clean water and funding for education and so on, my perspective is that our hope is with the youth. I know that my children, who are young adults, care passionately about these issues, much more so than most people my age do. And I just wondered if you have any particular thoughts about that, or are there initiatives to sort of target the younger people to, prompt more action or take more responsibility for that?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think education is playing an important role. Like the educational systems across the country are I would say modernized to better include Indigenous history and Indigenous knowledge. I think Ontario is doing a good job, but like the westernmost provinces are probably on the leading edge of that work. We were actually just talking about this.
Yeah,
before
you
we
said
came up here.
BC and Alberta. Both.
BC and Alberta. Alberta mandated it, even under PC government, that residential schools and other Indigenous content would be included in K to 12. And BC's done the same, but they've also rolled it out in the curriculum and offered a wide suite of supports for teachers to actually do that work in the classroom. So I think that process needs to continue, and even through the work of organizations like Free the Children, where they have We Day and things like that. I like to think, my generation is doing all right, and previous generations, we have done all right, but we never were talking about social justice or fundraising to help, people on the other side of the world or in the north, when we were kids. So it really inspires me to think what this generation might be capable of doing when they're older. But I don't accept that we have to give up on the present, or that the status quo needs to remain, or that we have to wait for a generation to see change. One of the things about education, and I'm a part of this group, Canadians for a New Partnership. A couple former prime ministers are involved, and one of them was saying, it's education, that's the key. We got to educate the young people. And I told them, like, they're learning it. They are. That's not where the challenge lies. The challenge lies, like, with respect, with your generation, right? Because if I asked all your kids who learned about residential school, your grandkids who learned about residential school, 100% of the hands would go up in the air, right? But who here in this room learned about residential schools when they were going to, K to 12 or university, right? But I don't think that we need to accept that, right? Through books, through media, through the public sphere, through civil society, right? Like, we can affect that change in Canada today. But I think that whoever came up with that truth and reconciliation term was very insightful. Like, the first step is truth. It is hearing the truth, telling the truth, being honest about where things are at. And to me, education, public education, formal education plays a role in that truth telling. And then the challenge is the greater one, which is the reconciliation. How do you bring, those two things together? How do you, in concrete terms, through a man adopting another man, taking him as family, shorten the distance between worldviews and faiths and communities and things like that? Or on a national level, how do you rise to the challenge of making sure that every kid in this country, no matter where they're born, has an equal shot at life, right?
Okay, thank you for that question. Next question. Please raise your hand back there.
Hi, Wab. Just wanted to say thank you so much for the beautiful words. My mom and my daughter are here, and we're tearing up because it just really struck a chord when you're talking about, the analogy with the children and parents. So thank you for that. So I was just wondering what your family has thought about your memoir, and sort of what has their reception been to it?
Well, it's tough, you know. Some of my family love it, and some of them hate it. Yeah.
Really?
So yeah. So I think.
Why do they hate it, Bob?
Well, the ones who do, I don't know. I don't really want to speak about it too much because it is a live issue. But I think there's still. Well, I think some people, like I think on one level, some people may just have an aversion to having our business put out there on the level to which this does that.
Right.
And then I think on another level, I think there's still some work to do in terms of healing and reconciliation. But like my uncle, who's in the book, my sister, my mom, they're all very supportive of it, and they like it a lot. So.
Your wife?
Yeah, my wife. I wouldn't be able to be here if my wife wasn't wasn't a fan of the book. Yeah. So. Yeah,
Good.
It's important.
Another question? Right here, up here at the front.
You've talked about how the community and your people in general and the Truth and Reconciliation have allowed you to work towards healing between yourself and your father. A lot of families, when there is that hardness from one generation, comes down and hardens the hearts of the next generation. How did you break out of that?
It's an ongoing process, you know. And one of the things that I realized while I was writing this is that, you know, as I thought about how the priests and nuns must have made my father feel and how about my father made me feel, I recognized instantly that I'm making my sons feel the same way more often than I would like, you know. And so it was a wake-up call that I have work yet to do, you know. Like I said, we all want to be Mandela and Gandhi. Real easy to be that when you're on the rock in the middle of the bush in Northern Ontario, but it's hard when the kids are running around in Starbucks or at the grocery store. In those moments, I recognize that like I'm too quick to, you know, respond with my temper or to raise my voice or to chastise them or even, you know, even to make little oblique comments that might hurt their feelings, right? Because I remember as a kid how cutting those comments can sometimes be to a little person, right? So I don't think it's an easy process, and I'd probably be kidding myself if I said that I am there. But I think that, you know, part of what the writing process did for me is it gave me more insight into that. And I'm trying to use that as motivation and as a kind of barometer to figure out how much better I am doing as a father, right? And that is, to me, that is the big legacy of the residential school era. And, you know, I chose to begin with the reading about, you know, my grandma to give you insight to what family life was like back in the day. And yet this other thing was introduced, right? And that negativity still exists, you know? And you think about the residential school story, often we think, oh, it leads to addiction and violence and, you know, people on the street or, you know, people are continuously dysfunctional. And yeah, it has at various points in our lives. But you look at my family today, like everyone's successful. Everyone's got a doctorate or a law degree or, you know, a medical degree, right? And so we're not living on the streets or we're not, you know, drinking or anything like that. But still, it affects us. Still, the residential school legacy affects us, right? And to me, it is that manner of parenting, right? And so, and I'm not saying that we have exclusive dominion. I know that many people have a similar experience, and it came as a result of persecution, you know, in the ancestral homeland, or, you know, some experience along the way that led you to maybe cultivate some form of dysfunction. All I'm saying is that in these lands, for Indigenous people, a big part of that was unleashed by government policies, right? And so if you feel some kind of way about it, I'm not trying to raise that just to transfer my bad feeling onto your shoulders, but rather just to ask, well, if you do feel something about that past treatment or current mistreatment, then let's use that sentiment to motivate good work and motivate a response, right? And it might be that maybe that's a political thing, but hopefully it happens first in the home, and hopefully, you know, first I can become that dad I want to be, and everyone here can become that parent or grandparent that they want to be. Yeah.
Another question? We have a question back there in the back row. We'll take one more question after this, and then we'll have to wrap up.
Hi, Wab, for sharing your story and sharing your thoughts on your writing your book. I appreciate it very much. We met earlier this year at Western when Sisters of All Nations sang. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah,
No diggity.
That's right. They were so nervous about it, but they loved it. It was awesome. I had a question. I spent the summer working in a Métis settlement back in Alberta. And one of the things we worked on was running sports and arts programs. And we had some really vulnerable like relationships, and we had some really cool developments happen throughout the summer. And we did so many cool things with the youth. The question I have for you is a writerly based one, memoir based one. You shared so many stories in your book, and you share so many stories eloquently, like you did at Western and throughout your career as you tour around. I guess the question I have from you, coming from a writer who's struggling to share those stories in a good way, from the teachings that I've had from my family, and I'm Métis, I was wondering what niche teachings guided you in the writing of your memoir, and what you carry with you as you carry other people's stories.
The traditional teachings. I did like Tibwe Win is one of the 7 grandfather teachings. It is truth, tell the truth. I think that's important, to be honest. Even if you're writing fiction, I think you're trying to get at some truth, right? And so being honest about what that is important. And for me, I think a lot of that, my understanding of how to tell truth came from working in journalism. Because like, you quickly realize that you can have no sacred cows in journalism, and you realize that, you know, like if you practice journalism with an agenda, then you're failing your craft, right? And some people that you think should be good turn out to be losers and liars, right? And you discover that over the course of developing as a writer. So I would say, I think being a journalist is very, very helpful, and being in a professional environment is very helpful too. Something happens if you spend a year, 2 years, 5 years in a newsroom and you get vetted every day, meaning your stories get edited every day, and you have to learn how to ask tough questions, and you have to put yourself in, you know, a scrum and figure out how to navigate that thing. And so that's you know, a modern iteration of what I would say is a traditional teaching. So I would encourage you not to think of the traditional teachings as being separate from your everyday path, right? So for me, I try to ground my professional and my career path in what I understand as a traditional teaching. But yeah, if you're trying to be a writer, I would say find an editor. Or somebody that can give you feedback on your work, because I think the best writers are ones who have gone through intensive editing in the past and have had their work criticized. And I think mentoring is really important too, because I learned a lot of the techniques of storytelling from working with really experienced producers at CBC, at Al Jazeera, you know, working with you know, really experienced journalists and stuff like that. So I would just say do as much of it as you can. Sherman Alexie, Native American writer, he said read 1,000 pages for every 1 page that you write. So I think reading a lot is important, finding an editor is important, writing a lot is important, and you know, learning the techniques of storytelling is important.
Okay, one more question and then we'll wrap it up. Yes, up here in front. Right here. Second row.
Hi. Thanks, Wab, for all your sharing. I work in a high school where I'm trying to tell kids every day, tell your story. You know, and by grade 12, they don't want to share too much. So this piece of work is going to really help me try and get some kids to talk about what's going on for them. So you've talked a lot about education. I'm trying to build an education program around Aboriginal studies. So what 3 things, if you were building a program in a high school, would you like to see in the curriculum?
I think for sure you have to start with the culture. I mean, I'll tell you a short anecdote to illustrate my point. I went to Columbia University this one time, and I met with like these very bright young Native American students there, and they're telling me all about the summer institute that they were building, and they're like, yeah, it's gonna be awesome. We're flying out kids from all these reses out in the western US and all over the place. They're gonna come here for a week, and then we're gonna teach them about genocide. And I was like, that sounds terrible. It's like, why would you start with genocide? you know. I think you have to start with culture and language, because that's strength and positivity, and it's a good starting point. Then if you're going to do, and I think you should, dive into the more challenging aspects of history, like residential schools, like the Indian Act, stuff like that. But if you start from the positive, then it'll probably better equip the students to be able to make sense of the negative, and it'll probably give them a better appreciation for what was lost too. So I'd say culture and language is one, and then two, like the negative aspects of colonization generally, but specifically residential schools in the Indian Act. And then the third thing is I want like the contemporary, role models. I think role modeling is really huge. And what we've seen at the University of Winnipeg with the young people that we work with, it's important for all young people to see themselves reflected in high achievers, but it seems particularly important for young women to see themselves reflected. So like one survey that we did with a group that we worked with on a business program found that 75% of young women, whereas overall they said 50% of the young people thought that they needed to see a role model that looked like them. 75% of young women said that they wanted somebody like them to be highlighted as an achiever or as a success story. So I'm not too sure specifically what course content you're looking at, but there are people in every field, right? Like there's people in medicine, like Marsha Anderson Dakota or Dr. Evan Adams, or in business you got, Clint Davis or Dave Tuckeroo or Nicole Burke-Boucher, right? Or in sport you got, Carey Price and Juan Corn Miller. And so I think any field or any subject area you're in, you can find some great stories to highlight. Even some historic ones, right? Like there was this guy, and I think his name is Orenda. Have you ever heard of him? Like 150 years ago, this guy was unreal. One of the first Indigenous medical doctors in Canada, right? Like 150 years ago, so before the treaties were even signed, never mind broken, He was already a medical doctor, one of the first Aboriginal Oxford scholars. He was an athlete of international standing. He was a politician. He was a war veteran, and he was the CEO of a successful multinational corporation, like 150 years ago, right? So there's a lot of stories of amazing people like that, and then there's also the contemporary stories. So I think sharing those are really good, right? Because it can inspire the young people, but then it could also say like, okay, he was doing that 150 years ago. Imagine what his descendants could have done had they not been confined to the reserve, or had they not been taken to residential school and stuff like that, right? So a lot of different ways you could take that. Yeah.
Folks, read the book. Wab, a privilege to have you here.
What a professional, eh? Amazing. Thanks, Eric. Thank you. That was really good.
Thank you both, Eric and Wab. That was fabulous. Wab is going to sign copies of his book back at the room, so you're welcome.